hot summer day in 1902, 7-year-old Spencer W. Kimball attended a community outing with his family at Clough's Ranch outside Thatcher, Arizona. As many swam in the pond below the cottonwood trees, Spencer's father, Andrew, took him out on his back since young Spencer could not yet swim. When Spencer became anxious in the deep water, Andrew carefully returned him to the shallow end of the pond. But as Andrew swam away, Spencer suddenly slipped. He recorded,
"I take a step toward shore and fall into a deep hole. Down, down, down. Water is filling my lungs. I cannot scream. Why doesn't someone get help? Will they never rescue me? I thought I had drowned."
Fortunately, several people on the shore spotted the sinking boy and called out to Andrew, who quickly retrieved his drowning son.
Eventually, young Spencer did learn to swim, but he never forgot the terror of that near-fatal experience. This was just the first of many dangers and illnesses that could have taken his life. Spencer battled with smallpox, typhoid, cancer, heart attacks, open heart surgery, 3 brain surgeries, and many other illnesses. Throughout these trials, he often looked back upon his many escapes from danger and wondered why the Lord had spared him from death. However, by the time his life drew to a close, the reasons were abundantly clear. As a loving father and a leader in his community, Spencer W. Kimball made important contributions. But much more significantly, he was preserved that he might humbly yet powerfully bless the world as a modern prophet of God.
Seeking religious freedom, Richard Kimball immigrated to America in 1634. 6 generations later, Heber C. Kimball, the grandfather of Spencer, came in contact with the restored gospel and was baptized in 1832. A faithful saint, Heber was soon called as an apostle, and at the instruction of Joseph Smith, entered into the practice of plural marriage.
In 1848, Heber and his family made the trek to the Salt Lake Valley, and 10 years later, one of his wives, Anne Alice Gein, gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. The girl they named Alice, while the boy, Spencer's father, was named Andrew.
At the age of 24, Andrew Kimball married Olive Woolley in the endowment house on Temple Square, and the young couple began their life together. In December of 1882, Olive gave birth to a baby girl, who tragically lived only 10 months. In the coming years, however, their loss was softened as they welcomed 10 more children into their home. Their 6th child was a 9-pound baby boy who was born on March 28, 1895. They named him Spencer Woolley Kimball.
Although Spencer began his life in the Salt Lake Valley, he did not live there for long. In 1898, Andrew was called as the new stake president of the St. Joseph Stake in southeastern Arizona.
In 1898, when Mom was a year old, they lived in Salt Lake City, and her father received a call to come to Arizona to preside over the St. Joseph Stake, headquartered here in Thatcher. And they loaded up promptly and moved down here, but not with the congratulations as you'd usually find for somebody that's called to a high position. They treated them as if they were going to a place very, very undesirable, where there's nothing but snakes, Gila monsters, lizards, scorpions, and so hot that you couldn't stand it. And the interesting thing was that after they got down here for a while, it wasn't nearly that bad.
Despite all negative comments, however, the Kimballs soon settled into a 3-bedroom adobe home with no bath, sink, or running water, and a tent attached to the side to make more room.
My mother, Claire, was the oldest living child. I don't remember just how old she was, but Spencer was just 3 or 4 years old maybe when they came to Thatcher. The people of Thatcher welcomed them here and gave them 10 acres on which to build their home.
When Andrew and the older boys started farming, little Spencer was not much help. In fact, his brothers called him a busybody, as his playing often interfered with their labors. In time, however, Spencer joined his brothers and sisters in the farm work, as well as chores around their new brick home. By the age of 5, he was milking cows, feeding the chickens and pigs, and pitching hay.
Spencer's older brothers loved to tease him, especially when they were putting up hay. They'd put him at the back of the wagon, and then they'd pitch the hay towards him and bury him with the stacks of hay. One day he wanted to be done with the work, and they were still pitching hay, and he heard the primary bell, and he knew that was a call to be someplace else. So while they continued to pitch the hay up into the wagon, he scampered out the wagon and ran across the field, and they didn't see that he was gone until he was halfway across the field.
In the summer of 1900, Andrew gave Spencer and Alice a section of the family potato garden for their own. At harvest time, Spencer and Alice dug up the potatoes and scrubbed them clean. The two children then dressed in their best, loaded their produce in Spencer's red wagon, and headed off to sell the lot.
They take the little wagon and fill it with some of their produce that they'd raised, the fruit, vegetables on their little backyard, and go and peddle it all around town.
When they showed their earnings to Andrew, he reminded them,
"The Lord has been kind to us. We planted and cultivated and harvested, but the earth is the Lord's. He sent the moisture and the sunshine. 1/10 we always give back to the Lord for his part."
Spencer's parents also taught him the power of prayer. Family prayers were held morning and evening, with the family circled around the piano stool and their hands placed together on the seat. Even though Andrew was away much of the time with his stake duties, Olive regularly took her children to sacrament meeting from the time they were babies. If they became tired or fussy, she allowed them to doze in her lap, even when they were older. Later in life, when Spencer was reminded of his sleeping in church as a child, he commented,
"I was just unconsciously absorbing the sermons."
At the age of 7, Spencer was enrolled in school. He was a dedicated student and even won several awards for his perfect attendance. However, Spencer also loved recess, where he would shoot marbles and play games such as kick the can, pom-pom pull-away, and leapfrog. Another highlight of the day for young Spencer was running home after class and finding his mother there waiting for him. He would often charge in the front door calling, "Ma, Ma, Ma." He merely wanted to know that his mother was there.
On his 8th birthday, Spencer was baptized by his father in a large steel tub filled with well water. In time, however, the validity of the baptism was questioned because Andrew had not entered the water with him as John the Baptist had done with Jesus. Therefore, Spencer was rebaptized 4 years later in the nearby canal to make sure that the ordinance was performed correctly. Spencer's faithful parents taught him much in his youth, but unfortunately many tragedies and hardships awaited the young boy.
Since Spencer's birth in 1895, the Kimballs had been blessed with 3 additional daughters, Alice, Fanny, and Helen. In 1903, 8-year-old Spencer awaited the birth of yet another sibling. Sadly, however, this newest baby girl, whom they named Mary, lived only days. Spencer wrote,
Baby Mary stayed only long enough to get her body and her name, and then hurried away.
Still reeling from this tragedy, the Kimballs were tried even further when just months later, on Spencer's 9th birthday, 5-year-old Fanny died after a long and painful illness. Spencer remembered,
"On my 9th birthday, Fanny died in Mother's arms. All of us children were awakened in the early night to be present. I remember the scene in our living room, my beloved mother weeping, with her dying little 5-year-old child in her arms.
Later that same year, young Spencer faced a different, more personal trial.
One morning at the breakfast table, his siblings, Gordon and Dale, started laughing at him. And they said, "Spunk, what's the matter with your face?" Spunk was a nickname that my dad hated. They were just teasing him, but then they realized one side of his face was paralyzed. When it didn't get better, they called the doctor, and he didn't know what to do with it, and so they decided that they would take him to Salt Lake. But it got better, and so he didn't get to go to Salt Lake, and he felt terrible about that.
Not long after this time, Spencer faced one of the greatest trials of his life. Since the deaths of Mary and Fanny, the Kimballs had been blessed with another daughter, Rachel. Yet tragically, Olive's 12th pregnancy would prove fatal. Following a miscarriage, infection left her both weak and depressed. In an effort to boost her spirits, Andrew sent Olive to Salt Lake to be with family and the best doctors in the region. But unfortunately, the intended holiday was not enough to restore her health.
In the fall of 1906, Spencer and his siblings were called home from school. There, they were met by Bishop Moody, who had been sent by their father, now in Salt Lake, to inform them that their mother had passed away.
One of the times that my father talked about as among those most tender in his life was when his mother passed away. It was hard for him to lose his mother at such an age, and almost all the years afterwards in his journal he would note his mother's birthday, and he would wonder as to whether his father and mother would approve of him. He talked about how hard it was to come home from school and yell, "Ma, Ma, Ma," like he used to do, just wanting to know she was there.
Spencer, I'm in here.
That didn't happen anymore, and he mourned over it.
However, young Spencer in time came to terms with the loss of his mother and sisters. Spencer also received good care from his new stepmother, Josephine Clough, who was sealed to his father in the summer of 1907.
This, of course, was a terrible time for Spencer, but it was also a period of tremendous personal growth. As he dealt with these deaths and with his own recurring illnesses, Spencer gained maturity and understanding and compassion that would help him throughout the remainder of his life, not only in the struggles he would face in the future, but also when he acted as a comforting voice to the thousands whom he would counsel in times of their own trial.
To help ease his loss, Spencer would often sing hymns or rehearse the Articles of Faith and the Ten Commandments. Once, Andrew and a neighbor came across Spencer singing a hymn while milking a cow. Andrew commented to his friend,
"That boy Spencer is an exceptional boy. He always tries to mind me, whatever I ask him to do. I have dedicated him to be one of the mouthpieces of the Lord willing."
No longer a little boy, Spencer was faced with many new responsibilities. One escape from this work was practicing the piano in the shady parlor. Spencer confessed.
My brothers accused me of always wanting to practice when it was hottest, and when there was ditch digging, plowing, or weed pulling to do. They were not far wrong.
As a result, Spencer practiced whenever he could and became quite a competent pianist.
During this time, Spencer was also recruited by his father as an assistant of sorts to help with business and church correspondence. He took dictation on so many letters for his father that he even developed his own form of shorthand. Spencer would then type each letter using the two-finger approach, despite the fact that Andrew enrolled him in typing lessons several times.
An important story that I think shows a lot of the character of Spencer W. Kimball was when he, as a young Aaronic priesthood holder, was in a meeting, and Susie Young Gates, Brigham Young's daughter, who was known as the 13th apostle, asked who had read the Bible from cover to cover. And as young Spencer looked around to see who would raise their hand, realized only a few people did. Well, this planted in him a desire that he wanted to be one of those people who could raise his hand and say, "Yes, I've read the Bible from cover to cover." So that evening, apparently, he went home, took the family Bible, and went up to his room, and by a lamp, he started to read. It took him nearly a year to complete the task, but he finally closed the Bible, having read the whole text from cover to cover. Now, I think one of the other important things is that this experience sets in motion things that will have a great impact in the church later on. He, of course, will set the course of study that will study the scriptures on a regular basis.
For God so loved the world.
At the age of 14, young Spencer was called as a Sunday school teacher in the Thatcher Ward. And the following year, he completed the 8th grade and graduated from grammar school. While many in 1910 considered this sufficient education for children, Spencer was strongly encouraged by his father and stepmother, Josie, a former school teacher, to continue his schooling. Heeding their counsel, Spencer entered the church-sponsored Gila Academy that fall. Any self-doubt or anxiety he felt in starting at the new school was swept away when he was elected class president by his 50-some classmates, which position he maintained all 4 years at the academy.
Spencer also excelled in the school athletic programs. He played on several sports teams, including baseball and tennis, but his true passion was for basketball. On one occasion, his Gila Academy team even beat a visiting University of Arizona squad.
My father was the coach of the basketball team, and he said that Spencer W. Kimball was the littlest one on the team, but he was the fastest one on the team. And they were going to play the University of Arizona's basketball team. And they did play, and they beat them. And it's the only time in history that they did beat U of A. And President Kimball made the shot that won the game.
Despite being the youngest and smallest player on the team, Spencer became the hero of the night. He recorded,
"They're parading me around the hall to my consternation and embarrassment. I like basketball. I would rather play the game than eat."
Spencer was also a diligent student. In his 4 years at the academy, he received an A grade in every class except for one.
My dad was a fun-loving person. He always had lots of friends and lots of fun. And one time, when he was in the chemistry class, he and some friends mixed up some hydrogen sulfide, which is rotten egg gas, and the smell permeated through the whole place. And it caused them to have to dismiss school early.
Graduating with 20 others from the academy in the spring of 1914, Spencer was not only the graduation speaker, but sang a solo as well. As the president of the Board of Education, Spencer's father, Andrew, also spoke at the graduation, where he announced that Spencer would be serving a mission rather than going to college that fall. Although surprised by this news, Spencer was pleased, as he had always assumed he would serve a mission.
Shortly after graduation, a letter arrived at the Kimball home from Box B in Salt Lake City, calling Spencer to serve in the Swiss-German mission. Unfortunately, troubles in Europe that summer led to the start of World War I, and Spencer's call was changed to the Central States Mission, headquartered in Independence, Missouri.
Spencer spent the summer of 1914 as he had the previous 2 summers. He was working at a dairy in the town of Globe, some 80 miles to the west. He earned $62.50 a month plus room and board, and he was very diligent in saving nearly every penny he earned for his mission.
Young men who worked on the dairy not only did the milking, but they also washed the milk cans in scalding water, made their hands soft so that when they milked the cows, their hands cracked, got very painful. The hands would throb. Dad says that when they would walk along the railroad track that went from the dairy to town, they'd walk with their hands up so that the blood would drain out and they wouldn't hurt so much.
And so when he'd walk into town to church with a couple of other boys from the dairy, they would all hold up their hands to ease the pain. He'd often joke about how they all looked like they were being robbed and were surrendering.
On September 30th, 1914, 19-year-old Spencer boarded a train bound for Salt Lake City, where he was ordained a 70 and set apart as a full-time missionary. Traveling to Kansas City, Missouri by rail, he then made his way to the Central States Mission headquarters in nearby Independence.
Not long after Elder Kimball arrived in the mission field, he and his companion were assigned to travel throughout Missouri, preaching without purse or scrip. They had to ask people to take them into their homes so they'd have shelter for the night. They had to essentially knock on the door and hope that someone would be willing to feed them. The first night, they knocked on 12 doors before anybody would take them in. And finally, they were allowed to come into a home, and they had a light supper, and they woke up the next morning and looked at the mattress and saw that they had been sharing the mattress with all these little red spots, which turned out to be bed bugs.
In early 1915, Spencer was transferred to St. Louis, where the cold weather was often a deterrent. In fact, on several occasions, it was cold enough that his companion refused to go out. Yet undaunted by the elements, Elder Kimball would simply pull on his hand-me-down overcoat and tracked on his own.
Spencer also served in the city of Hannibal, where he came in contact with a relative by the name of Rose Kimball Bradshaw. Aunt Rosie, as Spencer called her, not only ended up providing Elder Kimball and his companion with lodging, but she also joined the church along with her daughter.
On the 28th of May, 1915, Elder Kimball received a shocking telegram from his father informing him that his sister Ruth had passed away. As the sibling just older than Spencer, Ruth and he had always been close. After their mother passed away, Ruth had become like a mother to Spencer, and now she too was gone.
While his grief was tremendous, Spencer found great comfort through intensifying his missionary efforts. This resulted not only in several more baptisms, but in a call to preside over the St. Louis Conference as well. Just 20 years old at the time, Spencer was the youngest elder in the conference.
Spencer W. Kimball's characteristic of simply wearing himself out in the service of the Lord is no better manifested than his mission experience. As a missionary, he had fun, he enjoyed his mission, and his photograph album demonstrates that. There is a period of time when his drive is manifested in a great photograph in the album showing him in bed, exhausted. And it was just this sense that he had to take advantage of the time he had, and that was to wear himself out in the service of the Lord.
Having faithfully completed his mission, Elder Kimball was honorably released in December of 1916.
Returning to Thatcher, Spencer enrolled in classes at the University of Arizona in Tucson, where he was able to live with his brother Gordon and his young family who lived near the campus. During the first semester, however, the United States declared war with Germany. As a prime candidate for military service, Spencer recorded,
"Today, war was declared with Germany. It is probable that I shall soon be forcibly enlisted in the army and killing my fellow beings. Horrors."
During the summer of 1917, Spencer worked on a ranch near Thatcher. While there, he came across an article in the local paper, the Graham County Guardian, which listed the faculty of the Gila Academy, including an instructor by the name of Camilla Eyring. Spencer had met this young lady just once, at a high school dance prior to his mission. Yet, as he read her name in the article, he received a distinct impression that he was to marry her. Upon investigation, Spencer discovered that Camilla lived in Pima, some 5 miles from Thatcher, and commuted by bus each day to and from the academy. With this information in mind, Spencer just happened to bump into Camilla at the bus stop in Thatcher one August afternoon.
He said, "I'm Spencer Kimball. I'm taking the bus to Pima too. Would you mind if I sit by you?" And I said, "No, that's fine." And so we sat together on the bus and visited. And I think we were both anxious to make a good impression because we talked about Shakespeare and Browning, hoping to impress each other with our likes and dislikes of literature, which was my great love.
Several days after this, Spencer arrived unannounced at Camilla's home on an evening when she already had a date planned.
Mother was getting ready to go on a date with a friend, and here came this new friend at the door. She liked this new man. She didn't want to just excuse him, so she said, you know, if a bunch of us are going to the dance, would you like to go with us? And he was very delighted and said, sure, he'd like to go. And so Mother and Dad went, and here was Alvin, and he was not very pleased. Mother said he drove like the devil was after him, and he wouldn't dance with her at the dance and didn't dance with her for 15 years after.
Spending every free moment with Camilla for the next week, Spencer sorrowfully bade her goodbye as he departed for Brigham Young University. Not long after his arrival in Provo, however, Spencer received word from the draft board that he was to report for induction in Safford, Arizona on October 3rd. Returning to Arizona, he received additional word that his date of induction was being postponed. Therefore, Spencer and Camilla resumed their courtship and in a matter of weeks decided to marry on November 16th, 1917.
Less than 2 weeks after their wedding, Spencer learned that his military assignment had been postponed indefinitely. So the newlyweds rented a furnished home for $15 a month, and Spencer found a full-time job with the Citizens Bank.
In the spring of 1918, Spencer and Camilla finally traveled to Salt Lake City, where they were sealed together on June 7th, 1918. Just 3 months later, despite a difficult pregnancy and delivery, the Kimballs were blessed with a son, Spencer Levan, on August 26th. Camilla left her teaching job, and Spencer increased his work responsibilities to better provide for his growing family. In addition to bookkeeping for a local store and serving as the state clerk, which was then a paid position, Spencer also played the piano for a dance band in the evenings.
In 1921, Spencer was promoted to assistant cashier and transferred by the bank to the main office in Safford, several miles southeast of Thatcher. Along with this new position came an increase in salary, which made it possible for the Kimballs to purchase their first home. Shortly thereafter, the Kimballs welcomed a second child, Olive Beth, into the family. She was born on July 31st, 1922. But as Spencer rejoiced in the prosperity of his own family, he was again saddened by the loss of loved ones.
In October 1922, his stepmother Josie passed away, and 18 months later, his father also passed away after a painful illness.
My grandfather, Andrew Kimball, was president of the St. Joseph Stake in Arizona. He died in Salt Lake City, and President Grant accompanied the body to Arizona for the funeral.
At his father's graveside service, Spencer Kimball broke down, almost uncontrollably weeping. This was a man with such a tender heart. Here he was, losing his father. He'd lost his mother when he was a young boy and several of his sisters. President Grant was presiding at the funeral, and I'm sure that he noticed the tenderness of that moment.
After the funeral, President Grant summoned a special state conference to reorganize the presidency. And he organized it by calling Harry Payne as the stake president, and the second counselor, 29-year-old Spencer Kimball.
In addition to his new responsibilities in the stake presidency, Spencer also continued his duties as stake clerk, as well as pursuing several important career opportunities. In 1925, he partnered with Bishop Joseph Greenouch in a sideline business of buying installment contracts.
Just 2 years later, Spencer left his position with the bank to begin an insurance and real estate agency with Bishop Greenouch. Leaving a salaried position was certainly a risk, especially when the Kimballs added a third child, Andrew Eyring, to their little family on March 5, 1927. However, once the business was up and running, Spencer discovered the freedom associated with being his own boss and was heard to say that he would open a peanut stand before he would go back to working for someone else.
Unfortunately, the stock market crash of 1929 and the ensuing depression wreaked havoc on the little Kimball Greenouch agency. And to make matters worse, the bank with the Kimballs' account failed shortly thereafter, wiping out nearly all of the family's savings. During this same time, the Kimballs' fourth and final child, Edward Lawrence, was born on September 23, 1930.
When Eddie was nearly 3, he became ill and had difficulty standing.
When I became ill, there had been no other cases of polio in the neighborhood, and so it took some time for a diagnosis to be made. When they finally decided what it must be, then my parents got me in the car and rushed me to a children's hospital in Los Angeles where specialists were available. They put me in quarantine immediately. This was on my 3rd birthday, so you can imagine how frightened I was. But I was kept from my parents, and I screamed and yelled, wanted my mommy and my daddy. They would have liked to comfort me, but they were not allowed to be in the room. So I can remember now and picture the standing outside the room and talking to me through the crack in the door. My father, after a few days, had to return home to take care of the other children, whereas Mother and I stayed in California through the course of initial treatment for polio.
For the next 8 years, the Kimballs would be in and out of hospitals, as Edward underwent numerous surgeries and was fitted with various leg braces.
During this same time, the nation began its slow recovery from the Great Depression. The Kimball Greenouch Agency had ridden out the storm. In 1935, Spencer and several business associates established the first radio station in the region, and the following year, he was elected district governor of the Rotary Club.
On February 20th, 1938, Elder Melvin J. Ballard of the 12 traveled to southeastern Arizona to divide the ever-growing St. Joseph stake. The division created the new Mount Graham stake, and Spencer W. Kimball was called as its new president. Needless to say, Spencer's already busy life got even busier.
The day when the telephone rang and our son answered it, and he said, "It's for Dad, Salt Lake's calling." And he had said to the operator, "My father's not here." And then just then, Spencer came in the door.
Spencer, is that you?
And he answered the phone, and I, of course, was interested. And he answered the voice and said, "President Clark, you don't mean not me. I could never do anything like that." And then he was reassured, and it was obvious I wondered. And when he finished his conversation with President Clark, he just dropped to the floor and put his face in his hands, and I rushed over and sat down beside him, and then he began to tell me that they had decided that he should be one of the 12 apostles.
While unwilling to turn down the call of the Lord, Spencer was flooded with feelings of inadequacy, and he asked President Clark for some time to think and pray about the calling. It was decided that Spencer would travel to Salt Lake the following week to meet with David O. McKay, second counselor in the first presidency.
After Dad received the call, of course, it was very unsettling, and he spent restless nights having trouble sleeping. On the way to Salt Lake, they went to Boulder, Colorado, where my brother was in the Navy, and Dad got up one morning and went up the mountain slope, just climbing straight up without following a path, musing, praying, worrying whether he was worthy of the call. Finally, after he got up to a height, he sat and meditated and struggled. And finally, after all this anguish, the reassurance came that he was, in fact, called of God.
Flying later that day to Salt Lake City, Spencer met with President McKay and was reassured that the call was from the Lord. Shortly after their meeting, the calling was publicly announced so that Spencer would have time to tie up his affairs in Arizona prior to the October session of conference.
After selling the family home as well as his share of the business, Spencer moved Camilla and the 2 younger boys to Salt Lake City. Then, on October 1st, 1943, Spencer W. Kimball, along with Ezra Taft Benson, also recently called to the apostleship, were sustained as members of the 12.
Upon the death of President Grant in May of 1945, the new prophet, George Albert Smith, gave Spencer one of his greatest challenges as an apostle, charging him to look after the Indians in all the world.
Dad always had a great love for the Indians. When he was born, his father was the president of the Indian Mission in Oklahoma.
When he was 8 years old, Andrew Kimball took Spencer to Samuel Claridge for his patriarchal blessing. And in the patriarchal blessing, it said that he would do a great work among the Indian people. So he anticipated when he was called for his mission, he would serve the Indians. But it didn't happen that way.
One of Elder Kimball's greatest successes with the Indians began in 1947, when he was introduced to a teenage Indian girl named Helen John, who worked on a farm in Utah. At the end of the summer, Helen had asked her employer if she might stay in a tent on the farm during the winter so that she could attend school. When Elder Kimball learned of this from Golden Buchanan, he was inspired and soon began seeking more families who could take Indian children into their homes during the winter months and give them educational opportunities. In time, the program met with such success that it was adopted as an official church program.
In 1948, on a tour of the Indian reservations in Arizona, President Buchanan got their car stuck in some deep sand. They had to exert themselves physically to get the car out. During that exertion, Elder Kimball started to have severe chest pains. He waited until he got to Salt Lake to see a doctor, and the doctor said, "You need to take a month off." But the idea of taking a month off was unthinkable to Elder Kimball. That night, however, he was hit with such severe pain that he awoke Camilla to discuss funeral arrangements and the family's financial situation. Needless to say, after surviving the night, he decided to follow doctor's orders.
Following this time off, Spencer enthusiastically returned to work. But after just 1 week, the pains resumed, and the first presidency sent him to California, hoping that time away from Salt Lake would help. Spencer recalled,
"It was really quite a lift to know that the brethren were concerned about me. I am so small and weak in this great work of the Lord that it hardly occurred to me that I would ever be missed."
After another 6 weeks in an apartment by the ocean, Spencer returned to work feeling much better. Occasionally over the next few years, the pains would return, but Elder Kimball quietly carried on.
In 1950, another health concern threatened to impede the faithful endeavors of Elder Kimball when he began noticing a soreness in his throat and a hoarseness in his voice. Upon examination, Spencer's physician found a spot on his vocal cords. While the doctor determined that it was not cancerous, he still felt a cauterization would be advisable. However, after a priesthood blessing, Spencer's voice was restored and the cauterization was deemed unnecessary. Undeterred by these health threats, the young apostle became even more determined to use every day to its fullest in the great latter-day work.
In 1951, President George Albert Smith passed away, and the prophetic mantle fell to David O. McKay. Not long after, President McKay directed Spencer to visit the 7 nations of Central America, along with Elder Bruce R. McConkie, where they arranged with government officials for the preaching of the gospel in Central America.
In 1956, Spencer was again troubled by pains in his throat. After meeting with the New York Stake in February of 1957, Spencer visited a throat specialist in New York City. That doctor determined that the growth on his vocal cords was malignant and that eventual removal of his larynx would be required. 4 months later, Spencer and Camilla, along with Elder Harold B. Lee, returned to New York for the operation.
Elder Lee talked to Dr. Martin, who did the surgery on Dad's throat, and explained to him how important Dad's voice was to his ministry. And Dr. Martin agreed to preserve as much as he could, but even so, he had to remove one vocal cord and part of the other. But it turned out that there was kind of an artificial fold developed in Dad's throat, so that with one partial vocal cord, he was able to make sounds and speak again. After a time when Dad's voice had recovered somewhat, he was fearful of trying to speak in public.
And so the church assigned him to come to Thatcher for his first assignment because he was coming home and the people would be understanding. So the first thing he said, I was there, he stood on the stand and he said, brothers and sisters, I went east and fell among cutthroats.
In 1960, Spencer traveled to Australia and New Zealand to organize 4 new stakes.
Over the next several years, the majority of Elder Kimball's travels were concentrated around the work in South America. In fact, in 1965, Elder Kimball and Elder Franklin D. Richards were called to supervise the 7 missions in South America.
The First Presidency sent Spencer Kimball in 1966 to identify the first stake president and to organize the first stake in South America. So Spencer W. Kimball went to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and there, through inspiration, selected the man who would serve as the first stake president of the first stake in Brazil and in South America.
In 1969, a project on which Elder Kimball had labored for more than 10 years finally came to fruition.
President Kimball had said he'd never write a book like his colleagues in the Quorum of the 12. He felt he had no literary ability. But after counseling and handling the cases of morality in the church for over 15 years, there were so many who encouraged him to write about his experiences that he wrote and eventually published a volume called The Miracle of Forgiveness. That volume has become a virtual text for Latter-day Saints in understanding repentance and forgiveness.
On January 18, 1970, President David O. McKay passed away, and Joseph Fielding Smith was ordained as the prophet. However, when President Smith selected Elder Lee, who was the senior member of the 12, as one of his counselors, Elder Kimball, who was next in line, became acting president of the 12.
Unfortunately, shortly after assuming his new leadership position, President Kimball was again hindered by health concerns. In meeting with several doctors, it was determined that a new growth in his throat was malignant and treatment would be necessary.
The cancer in his throat was dealt with through a series of cobalt radiation treatments in November and December of 1971. These successfully countered the malignancy.
At that time, President Kimball confided in me that he was not feeling well, that he was having chest pain with exertion, that he was short of breath. So I referred him to Dr. Ernest L. Wilkinson, a medical cardiologist. Dr. Wilkinson asked me to do some diagnostic work and found that President Kimball, then Elder Kimball, had 2 things wrong. One was he had a very bad aortic valve, and the other thing is that his supply lines through the coronary arteries were severely constricted. When President Kimball really began to fail was in March of 1972. He called a meeting of the First Presidency with Sister Kimball, and then he had Dr. Wilkinson and me there for medical advice. He said to the First Presidency that he was a dying man. And then President Lee said, "What does surgery have to offer?" Looking at me as the cardiac surgeon. I said, surgery would require a replacement of his aortic valve and a grafting of his constricted main coronary artery. He said, "What are the risks?" I said, "I can't give you any statistics because we've had no experience doing a double heart operation on a man in heart failure at age 77. This is an operation I cannot recommend." President Kimball then said, "There you have it, brethren. I'm a dying man, and the surgeon doesn't recommend an operation." And at that time, President Lee rose to his feet. He pounded the table and he said, "Spencer, you have been called. You are not to die."
In the spring of 1972, Elder Kimball successfully underwent open-heart surgery.
We performed the operation on April the 12th, 1972. In doing an operation that complex, there are many steps, and things can go wrong. But not one thing went wrong. It was just like a baseball pitcher pitching a perfect game. Everything went absolutely perfectly well. And when we put the paddles on his heart and gave him the shock, boy, his heart took over with great power and energy.
That summer, while still recovering from the surgery, Spencer received word that President Smith had passed away. And in his stead, Harold B. Lee was sustained as the new president of the church, with Spencer as the president of the 12.
So the Lord took care of that man. Now, I mention this because I think the church needs to know that that very serious decision that President Kimball made really went in the face of medical advice. And he followed the counsel to have an operation only because it was given to him by the priesthood leaders that he sustained. And we as the doctors just watched the Lord work that miracle in behalf of this wonderful man.
Upon full recovery, Elder Kimball was soon traveling the world again. However, on December 26, 1973, President Kimball received word that President Lee had gone to the hospital for tests and there had suffered heart failure. Within hours, the beloved prophet had passed away, leaving Spencer W. Kimball next in line to be prophet, seer, and revelator.
On Sunday, December 30th, 1973, Spencer Woolley Kimball was ordained as the 12th president of the church, with N. Eldon Tanner and Marion G. Romney as his chosen counselors. Taking the motto, "Lengthen your stride," President Kimball set about with tremendous enthusiasm. In the past, the Brethren had held only one annual area conference around the world. President Kimball, however, conducted 7 in his first 18 months alone.
In November of 1974, President Kimball dedicated the recently completed temple in Washington, D.C. And the following year, he announced the building of temples in Sao Paulo, Tokyo, Mexico City, and Seattle. Under President Kimball's leadership, 26 temples in locations around the globe were dedicated or rededicated, making temple worship possible for hundreds of thousands of saints who otherwise would have been denied. For one who had so often been plagued with ill health, President Kimball was surprisingly robust during the early years of his presidency. His good health came as an answer to the daily prayers offered by the 3.3 million members under his charge.
After President Kimball became the president of the church, he had a series of regional conferences in the Pacific, New Zealand, Australia, and so on. When we got to Pongo Pongo, Samoa, he was really very ill. We gave him a blessing, put him to bed, and then woke up about 2 in the morning to catch our flight to New Zealand. So his personal secretary, Arthur Haycock, and I literally carried him on the airplane. He slept all the way to New Zealand. When they say we're beginning our descent into Auckland, he woke up and said to Sister Kimball, "You better comb my hair." She is so sweet. She said, "Spencer, which hair do you want me to comb?" Anyway, we landed in Auckland, New Zealand, and he walked down the steps from that airplane in front of all those TV cameras like a general inspecting the troops. And he submitted to a news conference with the media there in Auckland and gave answers to their questions that were just brilliant. Then, after a little while, he said, "Brother Nelson, I think I better go to my room. I'm not feeling so well." So I took him to his room. His temperature was back up high again. And then we went to Hamilton, New Zealand, and there they were to have a cultural event in conjunction with the large conference which was scheduled for the following day. President Kimball said to President Tanner, "I'm not able to go to that cultural event tonight. Please go, start the meeting on time, and tell them that I'm going to try to conserve my strength so I will be with them tomorrow." So I stayed back with President Sister Kimball, who by now had contracted the same pneumonia. I was in the room with President Kimball while he was sleeping. And then all of a sudden he woke up, straight up. He sat in bed and he said, "Brother Nelson, what time was that cultural event tonight?" I said, "It was to be at 7 o'clock, President." He said, "What time is it now?" I said, "It's about 7 o'clock, President. Tell Sister Kimball we are going." As we drove into that arena, I heard one of the loudest shouts I've ever heard. President and Sister Kimball were taken out of the car to their seats, and I went up to join my wife, and I said, "What was that loud noise?" She said, "You won't believe what has happened." President Tanner excused President Kimball, and then he called on one of the young New Zealanders to pray. As he prayed to his Heavenly Father, he said, "We are 2,000 New Zealand youth. We have been practicing for 6 months to perform for thy prophet. Wilt thou heal him and deliver him here?" And at the close of his prayer, in came the car with President and Sister Kimball, and everybody could see who it was, and they shouted all at once with a great shout of joy.
In 1978, President Kimball's effort to take the blessings of the church to all people took its lengthiest stride.
When you think about life and the brethren saying there is a time and season for all things, and that's scriptural. You look around today, why didn't we have trains and buses and airplanes 200 years ago? Men had intelligence then, but we didn't invent those things. There's just a time that God allows knowledge to flow, and it doesn't come until the right time comes.
In the early months of 1978, President Kimball spent many hours alone in the Salt Lake Temple, praying fervently concerning the question of priesthood eligibility.
I remember very vividly the day after day that I walked over to the temple. I knelt and prayed. And I prayed with such fervency, I tell you, I knew that something was before us that was extremely important to many of the children of God.
My personal belief is this: it couldn't have come 50 years earlier. It couldn't have come during the time Martin Luther King was marching. It couldn't have come during the time of Joseph Smith, because people were not ready for it at that time.
By springtime, he began discussing with his counselors and the 12 the possibility of lifting the restrictions.
During one such meeting in the upper room of the temple, Elder LeGrand Richards told his brethren that President Woodruff had been sitting there in the meeting with them. Now, the significance of that is easy to understand when you recognize that President Woodruff was the one who had received the revelation for the major policy change regarding plural marriage in the church.
And finally, we've had the feeling, and we had the impressions from the Lord, who made them very clear to us that this was the thing to do to make the gospel universal to all worthy people.
When he finally did receive the revelation, it's remarkable to me that he was not satisfied that he be the only one to receive that revelation. He wanted the brethren of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 to also have that same revelation.
On June 1st, in the Salt Lake Temple, the First Presidency and the 12 received powerful spiritual confirmation that the priesthood restrictions should be removed. On June 9th, a statement by the First Presidency was approved by all the general authorities, and the revelation allowing all worthy males to receive the priesthood was announced to the world.
In early June of this year, the First Presidency announced that a revelation had been received by President Spencer W. Kimball, extending priesthood and temple blessings to all worthy male members of the church.
I just really sort of had to be subdued a little bit. I was really excited. And we started getting phone calls, and my bishop called me after about an hour, and he invited me to come to his office that night for an interview. He interviewed me, and at the end of the interview was probably the most precious time. He looked at me and he said, "Brother Freeman, I've interviewed you to become an elder, but I also interviewed you to go to the temple, and I find you worthy to go into the house of the Lord with your family and be sealed for time and eternity."
In the summer of 1979, President Kimball underwent surgery to remove fluid from around his brain. But by the October conference, he was able to speak in all the sessions.
My beloved brothers and sisters, this is a great experience for me. I have waited for this day and hoped for it and believed for it. I have a great love for the people of this area. And so, as I express that love for them, I bear my testimony. It is divine. The Lord is at the helm. The church is true, and all is well.
Shortly thereafter, he traveled to the Holy Land for the dedication of the Orson Hyde Memorial Park on the Mount of Olives. Upon his return, he found he needed a second brain surgery, but again he recovered.
In the latter part of 1980 and the beginning of 1981, the 85-year-old prophet traveled over 50,000 miles, attending area conferences in the Orient, the Pacific Islands, South America, and the Caribbean. But age was beginning to take its toll on President Kimball. Out of simple exhaustion, he would have his secretary, Arthur Haycock, read his remarks at some meetings.
In July of 1981, President Kimball called Gordon B. Hinckley as a third counselor to assist the aging First Presidency. After another, more serious brain surgery later that year and additional heart trouble, President Kimball's health headed into a final decline.
On November 5th, 1985, President Kimball passed away quietly in his apartment at the Hotel Utah.
This man was a prophet of God. He walked like a prophet, he spoke like a prophet, he lived like a prophet, and he died like a prophet.
At long last, Spencer W. Kimball's mortal responsibilities were laid to rest. And while Spencer himself may have wondered why he had been preserved through such a long life, those who knew him and knew of his achievements did not. The life of Spencer W. Kimball was preserved, that he might bless nations, kindreds, tongues, and people through his humble dedication to the Lord. Clearly, Spencer W. Kimball was an inspired prophet.